Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to see everyone here and to sense the enthusiasm at this very special event. I'm Kent Calder, the Vice Dean of SAIS for Faculty Affairs, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone today for this special occasion. As I think most of you know, this is an inaugural event for a new partnership between Johns Hopkins University SAIS and the German Academic Exchange Service known as DAAD. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Margret Wintermantel, who is the president of DAAD, to help us initiate our new partnership, and I'll introduce her in just a moment. I should say from the very outset a word of thanks about this partnership. It's possible because of generous support from the German Foreign Office, and we're also particularly delighted to welcome Michelle Wunter-Fähring, who is the Minister of State from the German Foreign Office, and who has also joined us, and as all you know, on this 28th anniversary day of German reunification. So it's a special timing and it's a special event. And I also, of course, before talking a little bit about the substance, would like to note that we also, and I think this reflects the importance of this event, we have several members of the German Parliament, the Bundestag, which has also approved the funding for this special program. So thanks to everyone who has made this possible, sincerely. I should say just a word or two about the program that is being initiated, and of course the first aspect of that is a new colleague who has been able to join us, Dr. Christina Spohr, who is the new Helmut Schmidt Distinguished Professor at the Kennedy Center, the Kissinger Center, forgive me, Kissinger Center for Global. That was it. I do not make that mistake. Although in Washington, I guess that's easy to do. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs, and I think as many of you know, Frank Gavin and many other members of the Kissinger Center who have been building this extraordinary organization over the last couple of years. I think together with all of us at SAIS are delighted in this new development that Dr. Spohr is able to join us. So welcome, Dr. Spohr. I don't need, among those who know her, to go into great detail, but she comes to us from the London School of Economics. She's a specialist on the international history of Germany since 1945, and also has a theoretical interest in the theory and practice of contemporary history. She's just completing a book on the global history of the end of the Cold War from 1989 to 1992. She has a very important book, The Global Chancellor, about Helmut Schmidt and the remaking of the international order that came out recently from Oxford University Press, and of course the German edition, Helmut Schmidt, Der Veiled Kanzler, that many of you know. Of course, we have here at the Kissinger Center in Mary Cerroti, Professor Mary Cerroti, someone also who has written an important book on 1989. And so the combination of the interests of those people and the broader concerns of the Kissinger Center are creating an important new synergy, important for European studies and transatlantic relations, yes, but also, I think, for the analytical study of global affairs. I should note precisely because of that important catalyst that Dr. Spohr brings to us. Under this new program, thanks to DAAD, we have also initiated a postdoctoral program in the field of international relations and history at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, of course with an important synergy with the Kissinger Center. And several of the postdoctoral fellows are also with us today, and they will be hearing from them later in the program. Finally, and really to turn over our conference to someone that we appreciate so much for the contribution that DAAD has done, I would like to say a few words about our first speaker, Dr. Margaret Winter van Montel, who's been the president of DAAD since 2012. She's a leader in global education in general, as many of you know, but particularly, of course, in Germany, where she serves as president of the German Rectors Conference and also president of the University of the Saarland. She also has great familiarity with the United States. She's been a researcher both at the University of Michigan and also at the University of California, Berkeley, after completing her habilitation in psychology at the University of Heidelberg and her doctorate from the University of Mainz. So, Dr. Winter Montel, it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome you to SAIS.
Dear Professor Kent Calder, very nice what we're saying about me. Dear State Minister Michel Müntefering, dear Professor Frank Gavin and Dan Hamilton, members of the Parliament from Germany, President of the Goethe Institute, I'm very glad to be here. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be with you today to celebrate the official launch of a new cooperation between the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, or as they say in Africa, the DAAD, the DAAD, namely the Helmut Schmidt Chair at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. DAAD has a long-standing tradition in cooperating with the United States. Indeed, an exchange of a student from the University of Heidelberg to the US in 1922 resulted in the creation of the DAAD in 1925. It is also for this reason that the DAAD feels strongly connected to the United States and most highly values the existing academic cooperation. Today, the US are one of the most important countries for the work of the DAAD and one of the top destinations for German students and researchers. More than 10,000 Germans were at US institutions last year, and more than 6,000 Americans stayed in Germany. DAAD's priorities for cooperation with the US are the exchange of students and researchers from all disciplines in both directions, as well as promoting German and European studies. To this end, DAAD has, amongst other activities, been supporting Centers for German and European Studies in the US and Canada since 1990, two of them also based in Washington, D.C., here in Washington. The Helmut Schmidt Chair at SAIS fits perfectly within this strategy and is invited to network with the other DAAD-supported centers in North America and around the world. In times where the world is changing rapidly, it is of utmost importance to conduct research on the challenges and opportunities of the global transformation, as well as transatlantic relations within a new world order. In times where fake news and alternative facts inform the decisions of politicians and their electorate, science and humanities have a role to provide answers and guidance in the understanding of a more and more complex world. The Helmut Schmidt Chair is supported by the DAAD to further this mission, using funds amounting to roughly 3 million euros provided by the Federal Foreign Office of Germany for 4 years. Thank you. Thank you, Herr Görgen. Thank you. This program aims at conducting high-level research on global affairs and deepening US-German relations. Besides the Helmut Schmidt Chair, the program also funds up to 6 postdoctoral fellowships per year for young scientists from the US and Germany or Europe. I firmly believe that this partnership will provide us with new scientific insights and a deeper understanding of political and economic changes, as well as global challenges for the world in the 21st century. Hopefully, it will also contribute to intensify and deepen existing bonds between our two countries in academia and beyond. I would like to congratulate Professor Christina Spohr for accepting the challenge to be the first holder of the Helmut Schmidt Chair. She is the author of a recent book on Helmut Schmidt titled The Global Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt and the Reshaping of the International Order. Who would be better suited to pioneer this new collaborative project between SAIS and DAAD, between the US and Germany? Former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger gave his name to the center hosting the Helmut Schmidt Chair, commemorating the deep friendship between the two politicians. Henry Kissinger once referred to Helmut Schmidt as eine Art Weltgewissen, a sort of world conscience, and wrote in the Zeit, in the German newspaper The Zeit, in 2015, in this text, Kissinger wrote, quote, "For Helmut, friendship was a partnership in the pursuit of truth and wisdom." This quest for truth and wisdom is also at the heart of all scientific endeavor, and I sincerely hope that the Helmut Schmidt Chair and the fellowship will carry out their scientific work in this spirit. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. Sehr geehrte Frau Professor Dr. Wintermantel, sehr geehrte Frau Staatsministerin, verehrte Mitglieder des Deutschen Bundestages, everyone else, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dr. Wintermantel, for those gracious words, and thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Dan Hamilton. I'm a professor at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. First of all, let me congratulate all of our German colleagues today on their national holiday, the Day of German Unity. Thank you for joining us on your holiday. Contrary to stereotypes, the Germans do work on holidays, right? At least the ones here today. Our program commemorates, as has been said, the long and deep friendship between Dr. Kissinger and German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. It's a friendship that Dr. Kissinger has said to be, quote, one of the pillars of my life. And the theme of our program, the United States, Europe, and World Order, also honors the work of both of these distinguished individuals with its attention to international history and statecraft, but with a focus on our troubled present and our uncertain future. Helmut Schmidt was one of Germany's most notable post-war chancellors. Christina, our colleague, has called him the global chancellor. In Dr. Kissinger's eulogy for Chancellor Schmidt in 2015, he said, also quote, Helmut was imbued with a deep sense of obligation to take his country from where it was to where it had never been. The most important prerequisites for statesmanship are vision and courage. Vision to overcome the danger of stagnation, courage to navigate hitherto uncharted territory. I don't know if Chancellor Schmidt would have agreed actually with the vision thing. He was a pragmatist from Hamburg. He was skeptical of visions. He is famous to have said, if you're having visions, you better go see a doctor. Nevertheless, from his base in Hamburg, Helmut Schmidt steered his country successfully through many turbulent times. We're particularly honored today, among all the distinguished visitors we have, to acknowledge Metin Hochverdi, who's a member of the Bundestag, and he represents the same seat in Hamburg as Helmut Schmidt. And so I really want to recognize Metin just briefly and ask him to say a brief word. Metin. Member of the fellow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Michel Müntefering, who is the Minister of State of the German Foreign Office, working with Foreign Minister Heiko Maas and in the fourth government of Chancellor Angela Merkel. And like Helmut Schmidt, Minister Müntefering is a member of Germany's Social Democratic Party. She's been a member of the Bundestag since 2013, serving on the Committee of Foreign Affairs and its subcommittee on cultural relations and education policy. And beginning with the tenure of Frank-Walter Steinmeier, I had the honor of actually working for him in the planning staff in the German Foreign Ministry some years ago. A unique experience, I think, to be able to do that. He had led the idea that the Foreign Office should recognize not only Dr. Kissinger in this way, but the friendship with Dr. Schmidt, Helmut Schmidt, and now he's Germany's president. So the good ideas get elevated. So the Foreign Office has really strongly supported the idea of the Helmut Schmidt Professor and this partnership with Johns Hopkins SAIS. We're grateful for your continued support, and please join me in welcoming Minister of State Michel Müntefering.
Dear Vice Dean Ken Calder, dear Professor Margaret Wintermantel, dear Francis Gavin, dear Professor Christina Spohr, dear Professor Hamilton, dear Mr. Lehmann, dear colleagues of the German Bundestag. Friendship is born out of dialogue, from talking to and showing interest in one another. This is what Helmut Schmidt and Henry Kissinger did. In this moving eulogy for Helmut Schmidt, Mr. Calder, Henry Kissinger spoke also about what made their 60-year friendship special. He said it was their ability to engage in continuous conversation. Kissinger and Schmidt did not always agree, but they were ready and willing to have a constant, uninterrupted, and intensive exchange. This is how they went from university acquaintances in the 1950s to close, lifelong friends. The willingness to engage in dialogue and to listen to one another is what we are badly in need of in this day and age, when German-American relations are becoming more complicated. That is exactly what this new chair will contribute, and there is no more fitting place for a Helmut Schmidt endowed professorship than at the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. The School of Advanced International Studies, SIAS, at Johns Hopkins University is if not the most renowned institution for the study of international relations. Creating such a prominent professorship for transatlantic relations is a great success. Beyond merely recognizing the deep personal ties that exist across the Atlantic, it is also a continuation of Helmut Schmidt's political legacy. He was instrumental in making the Federal Republic of Germany a significant foreign policy player in the 1970s. He, more than anyone else, may be said to embody the old Federal Republic, what Germany was and became after the Second World War. With a strategic approach and deep moral convictions based not least on Immanuel Kant, Helmut Schmidt advanced the cause of and built a solid foundation for multilateralism. It was in his strategic cooperation with others that he demonstrated how the ethics of ultimate ends could be balanced with the principle of responsibility. And that is how he defined statesmanship. His definition of politics was the pursuit of moral ends through pragmatic action. Although, as a citizen of Hamburg, he showed great deference to pragmatism. However, he quarreled with his public image when it was reduced to this one aspect of his personality. And yes, also when I was at school, everybody knows the thing with the going to doctor. You know, this quote was very well known in my generation, but not many know about his deeply philosophical worldview and motivations. The Veiled Kanzler, the global chancellor, as Professor Spohr calls him in her book, was constantly contemplating the fallibility of mankind, politics, and democracy. I think that this is what drove him, especially given his experiences as a soldier during the Second World War. The fallibility he witnessed not only in himself, but also in the state was stamped into his character. The great lesson that he drew from these experiences was responsibility. For the Federal Republic of Germany, this responsibility meant assuming full membership in a liberal, democratic, and constructive community of nations and values that was committed to constructive discourse. He also spoke about this when he accepted an honorary doctorate from this university in 1976. Today, it's up to a young generation to make their own contribution and to carry on this tradition. Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs Heiko Maas will tonight open the Deutschlandjahr USA, a program comprising more than 1,000 events throughout the country and with which we want to deepen transatlantic relations all across this country. And he will speak about the meaning of October 3rd, the German Day of Unity, which takes place today. For me, it was surprising and moving to see the brick of the wall standing outside. The United States is and will remain Germany's closest partner outside Europe. We are bound by 7 decades of partnership and friendship. Our societies are now deeply interconnected by a wealth of economic, cultural, and political ties. And nevertheless, we do see how, under the current US administration, diplomatic uncertainty between our countries is on the rise. For the first time after the Second World War, we see it is no longer self-understood that we share the same common values and interests, that we were the mainstay of our relationship for the more than 2 generations. We are convinced, however, that we must not call into question the key principle that always bound us together as friends and allies in the world, despite any differences of opinion. In a nutshell, the question is, do we agree with the statement that everyone's interests are served when each person thinks only of himself? Or do we think that we can achieve greater things if we act together and cooperate? Do we have faith in the idea of multilateralism as a platform for reconciling interests, a vehicle for progress, and a way to prevent war? In view of the changes we are experiencing all around the world, a close transatlantic partnership is not given. Rather, it was made possible by the conscious, far-sighted decisions of politicians and by a very close-knit network of personal contacts. And these contacts, these deep ties and intellectual exchange as the motor of global development is what we want to support through the Helmut Schmidt Professorship. For us, the United States is quite simply irreplaceable as a NATO ally, as a partner in the fight against terrorism. At the same time, we also know that Europe must become more self-sufficient and independent. On security issues, we must assume greater responsibility and play a stronger political role. Our cooperation with Africa, it's just only one example of this. And this also applies to key international organizations such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. For if other nations move in to fill the void that is created by the withdrawal of the United States, then instability will further increase. We must also accept that it's okay to have different opinions. Take, for instance, the United States withdrawal from the nuclear agreement with Iran and the reimposition of US sanctions. Together with France and the United Kingdom, we are working hard to preserve the Vienna nuclear agreement, which for many years would have prevented Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. One of our objectives now is to prevent an escalation in the Near and Middle East. The effects of a nuclear arms race would be devastating. Ladies and gentlemen, exactly 10 years ago, I had the very special opportunity to visit Helmut Schmidt in his office at Die Zeit magazine. Mrs. Spohr and I think also Metin has been there. On the table, I saw the legendary 1950s ashtray with a push button. The man I met was able to cut the chase and speak his mind. Also, he was focused on one issue, and that was education. I am certain, Mrs. Wintermantel, that Helmut Schmidt would have been very pleased to see how important higher education cooperation with the United States is these days, and that this chair is now part of that. For our young researchers and academics, the United States is still their prime destination, with more than 1,600 German and more than 4,000 US scholarship holders. The United States is one of our most important partner countries in this sphere. And through the Alexander of Humboldt Foundation, we are engaged in cutting-edge research, and it's by adhering to academic standards and engaging in substantial academic discourse that we develop true understanding of and respect for one another. And that is why I am all the more pleased to have the opportunity today to inaugurate a chair of transatlantic focused research at this prestigious institution. Its mission will be to develop new perspectives on and answers for current and future global issues. In the process, it will help deepen transatlantic dialogue to our mutual benefit. Ms. Spohr, with your professorship, we are sending an important signal in the domain of cultural policy. I am therefore very happy that you, a renowned expert on transatlantic relations and historical-oriented analysis of European and American foreign policy, will be the first appointee to and will leave your mark on this endowed chair. In terms of research, you will be focusing on nothing less than the role of the United States and Europe in a constantly changing global order. For this, I wish you every success. Helmut Schmidt would greatly approve, because you are not only assuming responsibility, but also bringing with you the requisite competence for the task. So thank you very much for this. Ladies and gentlemen, may this chair become a symbol, and more than that, a proof for responsibility, competence, and friendship. Thanks.
So we're going to lead now into a discussion among our chair and Frank Gavin, who's the director of the Kissinger Center, together with the postdocs who are here with us. Let me, besides Frank, who I think people know, and Christina, who Frank is going to say something about. John Michael Arnold is one of our postdocs here and has joined us. They've all joined us in September. Next to him, Elias Gertz. And next to him, Stefan Kieninger, with us this year, working on different elements of this broader theme, which they'll mention. And we're joined today also by Thomas Erndl, who's a member of the Bundestag and the speaker for the Subcommittee on Cultural and Education Policy, which is here with us today. So Thomas, I should say, is from the Bavarian CSU. So we represent all perspectives here today. They have unity today, and we'll see on Sunday what happens, because the Bavarian election is coming up soon. I'm going to turn now to Frank Gavin, my colleague who runs the Kissinger Center, to start us off. We'll go through here with some brief remarks from everyone, but we do want to turn to the audience and have a discussion of this topic, the United States, Europe, and world order. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. And I, before saying anything, I want to thank Dan Hamilton, who's done just extraordinary work to put not just today's program together, but to actually build the infrastructure for this partnership. Without Dan, none of this would have been possible. So please, let's give a round of applause for Dan. I also want to thank the DAD for their extraordinary generosity, the Bundestag, the German Foreign Ministry. And I think the relationship that we all know and that we've heard so eloquently discussed, the relationship between Dr. Kissinger and Helmut Schmidt, reflects in many ways precisely what we're trying to do with this partnership between the Kissinger Center and the DAD and the German Foreign Ministry. If you look at the relationship, which was a deeply personal, intellectual one, a great concern over the state of transatlantic relations at a time of turbulence and chaos and confusion, as we look now at the world we're in, this is precisely what we at the Kissinger Center and in this partnership with the DAD are trying to focus on and think about. I could not imagine a more propitious opportunity and a more needed one at a time of uncertainty. And we'll hear a bit about the relationship and its challenges moving forward. I also wanted to mention, I saw Dr. Kissinger about 10 days ago, and he wanted me to convey to all of you his deep thanks. This is personally very moving to him. His relationship with Dr. Schmidt, or with Helmut Schmidt, as we heard, was a one of the most important political relationships he had in his life, and he's taken great pride and excitement in what is happening at the Kissinger Center, but in particular, what is happening with the Schmidt chair. So he wanted me to convey how thrilled he is, how excited he is, and how deeply moved and honored he is by this. And this leads to the final point that I want to make, which is how pleased he is and how thrilled we all are by who the inaugural chair has turned out to be. I have to confess, when we first started thinking about who the first chair would be, it was a bit of a challenge. We wanted to find someone who was deeply engaged in transatlantic relations, who was thinking about world order, who was sort of kind of a rising star. We didn't want to just dust off some octogenarian and bring them over. We wanted to find somebody who was making waves and doing new things. But the theme of the center is actually historically informed strategy and statecraft. I'm a historian, Professor Cerati, Professor Brands are historians. Dr. Kissinger, even though he got his PhD in government, really thinks of himself as a historian. And what he wanted to see in this relationship was a deep understanding of the past and the use of the past to make better decisions today and in the future. And particularly, it's not always easy to find people who engage in that. And lo and behold, we're looking through these applications, and Dr. Christina Sport, we couldn't have dreamed up a better person. Someone who not only is a rising star and one of the leading authorities, if not the leading authority, on transatlantic relations during the Cold War, who wrote edited a path-breaking book on conferences and summitry, has an amazing article on NATO expansion, which is a project we're going to be doing a lot on, but then has written this extraordinary and really insightful intellectual biography of Helmut Schmidt himself. So we are thrilled, and frankly, we think this is a sign, an incredible sign, a blessing from above about the great start that this partnership is moving on to. So again, I just want to make sure everyone knows how lucky we are to have Dr. Spohr, and to thank Christina. She's been here a month, and we're already thrilled to have her and for everything that she's done for us thus far. And we're very excited to see what else she does for the rest of the year. So thank you, Christina.
Well, thank you, Frank, very much for your kind words. Thank you, everybody, for your words that have been so far spoken. I won't go through the list of all the names again. It really is a great honor to be the inaugural holder of the Helmut Schmidt Distinguished Professorship, the chair at the Kissinger Center, and to have this extraordinary opportunity to think here in Washington about history and policy. It is also a great privilege to be able to work at this very moment here at SAIS on the completion of my new book, which is a global history on the end of the Cold War, and deep down the question how we ended up where we are today. But back to the Helmut Schmidt Distinguished Chair and the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. Schmidt and Kissinger, two statesmen who personify German-American relations since the founding of the Federal Republic 7 decades ago, in 1945. Two statesmen who encapsulate the longevity and solidarity of the transatlantic partnership, which is also epitomized in the slogan, "Together, wunderbar, wunderbar together," that you see today on the German Foreign Ministry's banners, here to the left and to the right. Now, what fascinates me about the Schmidt and Kissinger relationship, Helmut and Henry, is how special it was. Two men who in so many ways inspired international diplomacy and shaped political discourse over 6 decades. I want to make 3 quick points about their distinctiveness and legacies. First, they were two statesmen who were also intellectuals. They brought to international politics an unusual depth of knowledge, an enormous intellectual hinterland, as evident in the numerous books that they each published. Kissinger the Harvard professor who first met Schmidt in 1958, told a top Pentagon general around that time, "He's a bright young man who I believe is destined to go far." So you have to start somewhere. Some 20 years later, Schmidt became chancellor while Kissinger was Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford. After their political careers were over from the 1980s, each was, and in Kissinger's case still is, a revered elder statesman. Their gravitas ensured longevity. They remained prolific commentators on the world they had helped shape. My second point is that Schmidt and Kissinger were unusual in that they both thought globally. In what was still a bipolar world of Soviet-American confrontation, they grasped early on the rise of China and talked about tripolarity. Indeed, Kissinger's pioneering visit to China in 1971, aptly called Marco Polo, had been a venture into the unknown. 4 years later, in 1975, only 1 year into his chancellorship, Schmidt visited Beijing, the first West German leader to do so. But Schmidt took his global worldview a step further than his friend. Kissinger focused on geopolitics and the balance of power. Schmidt also connected security with economics. Security for the West in a globally interdependent world required economic stability. And in the global economic crisis of the 1970s, this could only be achieved through cooperation, not by fierce parochial nationalism. That's why Schmidt was a co-founder of what became the G7, a forum in which he hoped the leaders of the major industrial nations would hammer out solutions in a very informal private setting to deal with the greater economic problems of their time. And third, and this is my final point, Schmidt and Kissinger believed in face-to-face dialogue, in serious and sustained exchange of ideas. To foster dialogue, Kissinger believed in intense networking, a very American word, networking. Schmidt cultivated what he called political friendships, classically, for example, in Europe, with French President Giscard d'Estaing. Falling in and out of love affairs with another leader was not their cup of tea. But good interstate relations did not only hinge on good personal relations. For instance, a shared belief in the importance of the German-American bond allowed even a prickly pair like Schmidt and Jimmy Carter to transcend personal friction for the greater good. And they did so when pushing through the crucial NATO dual-track decision of 1979. So Schmidt's conception of political friendships notably stretched also across the ideological divide of the Iron Curtain. Acting as what he called double interpreter between Brezhnev's Russia and Reagan's America, he kept open the channels during the new Cold War of the early 1980s and thereby helped pave the way for the great transformations of 1989-1991. Schmidt and Kissinger, two statesmen, intellectuals, and personal friends, left many important legacies, two of which resonate, I think, with us particularly today. I would like to sum them up like this. First, true patriotism requires thinking globally. And if you wish, you can add to cooperate. And lastly, I would like you to take home the following. Think and meet. Don't shout and tweet.
So Christina's brought a historical perspective, Frank as well, to the issues, but we have a member of the parliament here who actually deal with today, Thomas. So I wonder how you view all of this, please.
Yes, today on such a wunderbar day, I have to say, I'm very glad to be here to participate in a establishment of a new partnership, especially in times where other partnerships may be questioned from time to time. So thank you very much for the chance to be here. Friendship and partnerships, transatlantic partnerships, is not a effortless miracle, as our Federal President Steinmeier wrote in the German Times, the newspaper which you saw outside, which was published especially for the kickoff of the German year in the US. And the friendship is actually based on many personal connections, and we heard the numbers from the student exchange, from Professor Wintermantel. These can be such personal connections, and therefore I think it's important that we invest in these connections, in these relations. And I guess such a connection, such a relation was also the reason that made at that time our finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble and at that time foreign minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier promised to Dr. Kissinger to establish that Helmut Schmidt chair. And I'm really curious on the work of this chair and to see whether you're able to carve out whether we think global as politicians, or we just pretend to think global and follow basically only our own interests. And I think it's absolutely fair to question conditions of partnerships, but I think we shouldn't question the partnerships itself, and it's important to point out in these days as well. So, yeah, important to know is whether the global thinking towards a functional multilateralism is a benefit to all of us, and I think it's a everyday task for everybody to point that out. And as I mentioned, I'm very glad to be here to see that German taxpayer money is invested very, very well. I was visiting Washington a few months ago, and I attended a panel discussion from an interesting organization called Americans for Tax Reforms. And I learned that every tax with a level above 0 is bad and is a bad tax. And I think this is a good example that there is also good taxpayers' money and invested very well in the future of such an important thing like the transatlantic partnership. And therefore, I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another characteristic of both Dr. Kissinger and Chancellor Schmidt were they were tough negotiators. And I just want to briefly recognize the person who had to negotiate with the Germans on the day for Johns Hopkins, Kim Morton. Thank you for everything you did to make this happen. Thank you so much. So I think the theme that you see is how understanding insights that come from greater historical knowledge can help inform current issues. And so our colleagues who have joined us this year are each working on that, and I think that's my question to them, how they think the work that they're doing is going to help us sort through not only what happened in the past, but how we should think about it now today regarding our own future. I'd ask each of you just briefly, if you can, to say something to that issue and sort of what you're working on here, please.
Thank you very much. Let me just say it is an honor to be on this panel today on a very, very special day. It's also an honor to be a DRRD postdoctoral fellow at SAIS this year. My research this year focuses upon strategic shocks. And by strategic shocks, I mean unanticipated events with major global consequences. So from the last few decades, big examples would include the opening of the Berlin Wall, the 9/11 attacks, the financial crisis of 2008. A big premise of my research is that we are currently living in an era of strategic shocks. Now, that is not unprecedented. There have been prior eras in history for which that was also true, but we happen to be living in an era of strategic shocks. If you think back over the course of the last decade, since the financial crisis, the world has witnessed a series of additional strategic shocks. You can think about the Arab revolutions that began in late 2010 and early 2011, Russia's intervention in Ukraine in 2014, the vote for Brexit by the people of the United Kingdom in 2016. And this, my argument is that this series of strategic shocks have posed a big challenge to the transatlantic community. That challenge is especially pronounced precisely because some of the shocks have come from outside the transatlantic community. Others, as we are all well aware, have come very much from within inside the transatlantic community. And so one of the challenges we face is how to respond when we are being shocked from the outside and from the inside. I am definitely out of the business of making political predictions. I grew up in the UK. I've lived in the States for 10 years. I am an American citizen and a British citizen. I was convinced that Britain would vote to remain in the EU and that Hillary Clinton would be president of the United States. So I have retired from making predictions. But what I do predict and what I'm confident about saying is that in the future we will face further strategic shocks. There is a whole extensive academic literature on why all human beings, tend to be bad about foreseeing change and recognizing dramatic change and assuming that things will continue as they have been. There are various bureaucratic and political constraints to anticipating and responding and preparing for shocks. So the premise of my research is that we cannot avoid strategic shocks. They are something that, unfortunately, in many cases, will confront us. But what we can do, and Minister Müntefering talked about the importance of academic research, what we can do is to look back and think about how the United States and some of its major allies have responded in the past to strategic shocks as a way to gain insight into how we can do better in the future when we next face a big strategic shock.
Thank you. Elias?
Okay. Thank you. My research is also deals with an issue which I think is also very essential for understanding world order and especially the European security order, and that is Russia. I think it's no secret that Russia has adopted a more active, some would say assertive, some would say aggressive foreign policy posture in recent years. I think on that point there is a broad agreement among many scholars and observers and policymakers. But I think that's also where the agreement basically stops. And as many of you also know, there's a huge debate, sometimes heated debate, about Russia's role in world politics today. And this debate basically centers around two central questions that I want to address in my research in the course of the next year. And the first question would be so a very simple, basic question, but I think extremely important one. What are the key drivers or the causes of Russia's more active/assertive foreign policy? And when you look sort of in the existing literature, you can basically distinguish between three positions. So on the one hand, you have some observers who say that Russia's more assertive foreign policy is basically just a reaction to actions and activities of the West. So it's basically sort of this pushback. Think of NATO expansion or also the increased activism of the European Union in the post-Soviet space. Then there's a second group of observers, and they say this is basically nonsense, and that Russia's policy is basically driven by domestic factors. And very important here, of course, the turn towards authoritarianism in Russia over the last couple of years. So the argument here is that the Putin government needs external crisis and external enemy to legitimize and justify its rule. And who is the external enemy? Well, it's of course the West. So the argument here is that Russia creates or manufactures these crises to create some sort of rally around the flag effect, or let's say rally around the Kremlin effect. So that would be a second position. And then you have a third position that says, or a third group of observers who say that these domestic factors are really just a sideshow, it's really just a footnote. What really drives the train are these larger ideational factors, like, you know, Russia's historical legacies, its national identity, its strategic culture, and especially its craving for status and prestige in world politics. So Russia really wants to be recognized as one of the big powers in the world, and that is why it's now pursuing a more assertive policy. So these are the three positions I think that are out there in the literature, and what I will try to figure out over the next year is which aspects and dimensions of Russian foreign policy can best be explained by what factor, because my argument or my premise would be that there are different aspects of Russian foreign policy that are best explained by different factors. And I can say more about it later on. I also say I will especially focus in my research on the creation of Europe's security order in the early 1990s and Russia's role there, and also on Russia's neighborhood policy, i.e. Russia's policy towards the other former Soviet countries, and how this policy has evolved over the last 2.5 decades. Then just very briefly before I finish up, the second question would then be more policy relevant, namely how the West should respond and react to Russia's more assertive policy. And the West, if you now treat the West as a unitary actor, you know, the US and Europe and Germany and different European countries, that's perhaps a big premise. But for the sake of the argument, how should the West respond? Should we adopt a hard-headed containment policy, as we did during stretches of the Cold War? This would then probably imply that we should ramp up our military deployments in Eastern Europe and the Baltic countries, or should we instead pursue an engagement policy? Now, speaking as a German, engagement policy sounds really nice, right? But the question is then, of course, what does this mean in practice? I mean, think just about the economic sanctions. Should these economic sanctions just be removed as a sign of goodwill, or should they remain in place, or should we perhaps even impose stronger and stricter sanctions on Russia? So that, I think, is the second question, how should the West deal with Russia today in order to create a more, hopefully more peaceful European security order. And the final point is also, I hope you can see that these two questions are actually closely interrelated, because I would argue that your answer to question number 2, how should we deal with Russia, very much depends on your answer to question number 1, what are the key drivers of Russian foreign policy today? I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Stefan.
Let me first say that it's a great pleasure to be a DAAD scholar here at TAIS in this wonderful research environment. My research looks into the financial and economic interaction of the States and the Soviet Union at the end. Micro?
He's working on it.
Now, better?
Yes, it's done from the back. Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Better? Can you hear me?
Speak into the mic.
Yeah. So my research looks into the financial and economic interaction between the United States and the Soviet Union at the...
Okay, here we go.
Okay. This
Yeah.
one? Let's give it a try. Better? Let's put this aside. Put this to the side, and I try this one. This is much better, huh? My research looks into the financial and economic interactions between the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. Back then, both were able to stabilize their security competition, and they managed to achieve arms race stability, and eventually they even managed to pursue cooperative security policies. Policymakers such as Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and Michael Gorbachev moved from traditional security policies based upon coercion to a new approach of cooperative security policy, trying to solve problems in cooperation, even with potential enemies. And I think that was a major precondition for the peaceful end of the Cold War back at that time. Now, my research looks into the emergence of a new concept of strategic stability back at that time. I argue that economics played a key role for the emergence of that particular new concept of strategic stability. Western financial help for the Soviet Union was key to the rise of the post-Cold War order. Western loans brought Michael Gorbachev's agreement to Germany's unification. Later on, in the 1990s, Russia's integration into the world economic order was key for Russia's tolerance of NATO's expansion. In a nutshell, economics was a catalyst for cooperative security policies. What are the implications for today? Today, the transatlantic community has considerably more economic interaction, both with Russia and with China. That adds to mutual security, one might say. That's a plus. At the same time, it might be a risk because trade disputes have the potential to undermine the strategic relationship between the United States and China. Most recently, China has pulled out of the next round of ministerial-level talks with the United States. Frictions are building up on nearly every front of the relationship. Let me say that I'm not a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries, actually. Strobe Talbot used this quote last week in a talk with Finnish President Niinisto at Brookings, just across the street, and I find it quite fitting. What about relations with Russia? Basically, I mean, in our relations with Russia, we still rely on the security structure that was established at the end of the Cold War. And the challenge is that we might go through a period of another 10 years or 15 years or so with just minimal progress. And currently, it is not clear whether we will be able to maintain the existing security and arms control framework. Think of the Strategic Arms Reduction Process, the INF Treaty, and the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe. But what we can do is to look back at history, trying to think of Henry Kissinger and Helmut Schmidt and their approach to these global challenges for the West. Thank you so much for your attention. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to my colleagues.
Thank you, Stefan. So we have a time to have a broader discussion on this theme, and we do have people with microphones. To get while you're thinking about that, let me just ask a question here, which I think goes to this nexus between history and contemporary issues. In the 20th century, it was very clear, I think, to most Americans and most American leaders that the nature of European order was critical to the nature of world order. The two were just linked. We had world wars, we had a Cold War, it was just U.S. interests were clearly involved. And Europe was not only important to the United States, it was urgent to the United States. If you got it wrong, it was not good. And I wonder today, however, whether that feeling still exists, whether the sense that the nature of European order is so clearly tied to the nature of global order in the minds of the American public or American decision leaders, or whether gradually that link is less clear. Europe might still be important, I think most people would say that, but whether it's so urgent, given all the other issues the United States has to deal with globally, I wonder whether that's still such a pervasive view. Maybe I'm wrong, but I pose it as a question. I don't know, Frank, whether you have a view, or Christina, or our others, but just to kick off this discussion.
Right, I'll give it a start and turn it over to Christina. One should always be careful of marriage analogies, but I think when talking about the U.S. and Europe, they seem to work particularly well. I think I'll make 3 points. First, that it's absolutely critical and crucial. Second, that it's largely taken for granted. And third, this level of, I don't know if I want to say dysfunction or concern, is not necessarily new. I'm going to start with the third point. One of the things about being in a city like Washington, and one of the things where I think the Kissinger Center and having scholars like Dr. Spoor to sort of remind people who live with time horizons that are measured in hours, to say nothing of weeks or months or years, is to remind people that the U.S.-European relationship has always been in a state of somewhat of disorder. In fact, to get to the marriage analogy, the way I think about it is we all know couples who, when we first meet them, when we're younger, we just assume that they'll break up, and then they're together 50 years later, and we said, how did that happen? And we recognized that it was actually that level of tension and dysfunction that kept the relationship together. And the U.S.-European post-war relationship is not unlike that. You know, I was just sitting here thinking about as a historian of post-45, if you were to just do a random search in any newspaper, and if you had had Google back then and said, crisis transatlantic relationship, I mean, there would be any sort of given year, you would find plenty of evidence. And I was just reflecting on this in terms of the U.S.-German relationship. While I was thinking about it, I was in Hamburg and Berlin in September of 2002, and right in the middle of it, when Gerhard Schroeder was way behind, he went way up by sort of criticizing the Bush administration's obvious impending policy in the Middle East, right? And the crisis was considered at an all-time low, and people were writing essays about how the transatlantic relation and the German-U.S. relationship was broken. During the period that Dr. Spohr knows so well with Helmut Schmidt, we're all saying nice things about him, but him and Carter hated each other, right? I mean, we all know this, and they had deep disagreements. And there was a sense, and even, we could talk about the famous speech that Kissinger gave in the 1970s. He said, you all wonder about the credibility of our deterrent. You have a good reason to worry, because we aren't going to use nuclear weapons on behalf of defending you. My first book was on international monetary relations, and if you look at the level of crisis between the Johnson administration and the Erhard chancellorship in '66 and '67, not just over balance of payments issues, but over offset disagreements and nuclear nonproliferation treaty negotiations. You go back and look at I was just lecturing yesterday on how furious Kennedy was at Adenauer in '63, and there's a whole interesting story there, or going back to Dulles and the agonizing reappraisal in '53 and '54 about U.S. relations with Europe. The point being that historians know it's bad and it's the worst, except for all the other times it was bad and the worst. And that gets to the second and the first point. One of the reasons why it isn't a central concern is because it's taken for granted, and like in a marriage, being taken for granted can be a bad thing, but it can also reflect deep, resilient ties, institutional relationships, a shared history, and a shared common interest that allow you to sort of nibble and fight and say unpleasant things at the margins. But I actually think it's fairly well recognized as a relationship like this between the Kissinger Center and all of you, that the deeper ties and bonds are there, and that the one needs to be cautious about talking about anything deeper than the sort of, this is not to say things can't get worse, it's not to say that our current American administration doesn't give us all reason to pause and wonder what will happen the next day. But looking at recent history, I think this is a relationship that's demonstrated its resilience over time and will moving forward.
Yeah, well, thank you. I pick up from that. As I said already in my talk, really, I mean, Schmidt and Jimmy Carter and Schmidt and Brzezinski, there were many explosive moments. And what I tried to show was that, sometimes because the state-state relationship matters so much, and because, you have a common aim, you try to overcome these personal animosities. But we could look at another historical moment where there are some similarities and, of course, also many differences to the present, which is the period at the end of the Cold War, when there was the question, how much should America withdraw from Europe? Germany was unifying, and, in all this sort of hiccup of, how you went about imagining the new world order. Of course, Germany unified, stayed in NATO, NATO stayed in Europe by default, America stayed in, and so, America remained a European power. Now, there are questions, where is it going right now? And I come back to this, the mention of the Finnish president's talk, who was here last week, not only because he's at the moment chairing the Arctic Council, which will be my second point, but my first point is he said he is interested in Macron's idea of making Europe in its own way strong, also militarily, not because one gives up solidarity with America. That should in no case be the point. That is, a given. But also because if you want to export a good European vision, it has to be strong. And if the people don't believe in that vision, that is a bad thing. And he said, look at the Baltic Sea situation. What have we got here? He said, from a Finnish perspective, they're not in NATO, but it's stabilized tensions. And it's utterly imperative that the Baltic states are and remain NATO members. It has stabilized the anxieties in that part. The second point was the Arctic. America sits on the Arctic Council. It's something that matters to all of us as a community of human beings on this planet. And we need to do something about climate change. And again, it's something where it bonds America and the Europeans, the Northern Europeans in this case, together. So I think on many levels we don't think about all the time, whatever the tensions that we are experiencing, there's strong elements where I think there is cooperation and where we should really work together for our common good.
If I can comment.
Sure.
I'm not sure if I can agree to be in the regular mode, because I think, well, first of all, transatlantic relationship I think is important, having always strengthened our strength, right? Considering new challenges, China and so on, I think it's important to strengthen our strengths. But I think the difference is if we have the European view, we see traditional political parties disappear, right? We have rise of populist parties, we have Italy, Hungary, Poland. So there is definitely a change, and I think the uncertainty we had in the past, so as you explained, is a regular mode. There were always uncertainty, there were always discussions, is one thing, but I think the new situation is that the uncertainty really leads to a different political environment, and I think this is something we need to consider, especially when you see the political party landscape in Europe, where things just are not as they used to be, and this is a big challenge. And I think this uncertainty is what we as political leaders need to handle in a certain way, that it doesn't lead to a complete revolution of the political system. And that's why it's so important to not just take it as granted, but work every day and point out how important our relationship is.
Comment here, or should we go to the audience? Okay, so I don't know if anyone has a point here. Michael Naumann. I should recognize Michael as an old Mitstreiter from long ago, and was the state minister under Chancellor Schroeder for cultural affairs.
Thank you, and I apologize for that. I've had the experience of working with Helmut Schmidt as a publisher of Die Zeit for more than 10 years, and basically almost a weekly meeting, either at conferences and at other places. And I also admit that I haven't read your book yet, Frau Spohr. But I'd like to point out an issue which would cast some kind of a shadow on that embellishing vision that seems to permeate this discussion of Helmut Schmidt. Why is it that his political ideals were Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, Sadat, and the changing heads of the Chinese party? So authoritarian figures, the like of which have caused the world a lot of trouble, except Sadat. But he admired them more than anything else. And his utterings on human rights issues were put down by his colleagues, including me, as the mutterings of an old man who has become cynical. But I think it was always his view that human rights seem to disturb politics. And while he was definitely a Democrat, he certainly did not understand what was going on in Poland. And that may have been the influence of Marion Dönhoff, the only woman he really respected. Otherwise, the Zeit was definitely masculine under his guidance. Obviously, I adore the guy just as well as you seem to, and we all do. He was a man of stability, but stability was more than anything else for him. And that led to a number of political decisions, including, of course, the conflict with Brzezinski, who understood who Wałęsa was. Whereas Marion Dönhoff and Helmut Schmidt thought he was just a proletarian, kind of a disturbance of the stability of Central Europe. And so, in short, I would very much like to find out amongst the younger scholars what his real attitude towards the ideals of the American democracy and the Constitution were. What did he really think about the United States? I only remember that after I wrote an editorial in Die Zeit strongly criticizing the planned Iraq war a year ahead of before it took place, it was the only time that he wrote me a really sweet letter. So sweet that I almost framed it, until I thought about it and said, what's behind it, actually? Okay, Frau Spohr.
Let me just give you a short answer. First of all, if you read the documents in part also in the foreign ministry, in the Auswärtiges Amt, you will discover that Helmut Schmidt was an avid supporter of the Helsinki Final Act, in contrast to his friend Henry Kissinger, who was not so keen, especially on Basket 3. So I think we cannot say that Helmut Schmidt had absolutely no interest in human rights. On the contrary, in particular also in view of the German question, Basket 3 was utterly important. Now, once we get to 1980, 1981, you will probably recall that in the spring of 1980, Helmut Schmidt was terrified that we might slither, schlafwandeln, into a kind of World War III. There were these Spiegel covers that reminded us that, you know, are we slithering into a situation like 1914? If the big powers end up clashing somewhere, perhaps in the third world, that it might spark potentially a clash in Berlin. And then we have a problem in Europe. So it's against that background, to him, to do this Doppeldolmetschen, to go to the Kremlin in 1980, but also to have summits in Washington, was to play between the two big powers, because the fear of war was greater than the issue in Poland. That is my answer to that, and I pass on to my younger colleagues. Thank you.
Someone want to say something about this?
I mean, I think the sort of the broader point that came to my mind based on that observation was the kind of the difference or the potential distinction between order and justice. And you know, this is one of the big challenges for U.S. foreign policy, for the foreign policies of liberal democracies in general. You know, order is one thing we want. We also want some notion of justice informed by liberal democratic norms, and of course those things don't always go well. They don't always go easily together. Trying to promote liberalism can be disorderly. Trying to promote order can mean that you're ignoring some of the demands of liberalism and human rights. So I think one of the big intellectual challenges, which has a huge impact for our foreign policies, is how you reconcile order and justice.
Well, yeah, I can just second what John Michael said. I also have to admit that I'm not a big expert on Helmut Schmidt, at risk of being expelled from this panel. But I would also say that your comment really alludes to this tension between power and authority on the one hand and principle and ideas on the other. I think one smart man, I don't know who said it, said that like ideas and morality without any order and power leads to chaos. On the other hand, if you have power and authority without any ideas and principles, this leads to dictatorship. So I think it's always about finding the right mix between these two big driving forces in world politics. And I think that certainly played a role in Helmut Schmidt's view on world politics, but I think it's extremely important also for many issues today, just to think of the crisis in Syria. How should one act in and towards Syria? I think there you can clearly see this divide between power, authority on the one hand, and ideas and principles on the other.
Yeah, thank you. Is it working?
No.
Yeah, no, it's working, okay. That's a very important point. Why was Schmidt focused primarily on stability? My short answer would be because he felt this kind of responsibility to be a kind of a mediator between the US and the Soviet Union back in the late 70s and the early 90s. He was instrumental in establishing NATO's dual-track decision. At the same time, he managed to maintain trade with the Soviet Union, and natural gas trade played a huge role. So it was his responsibility as one of the key leaders who did both talk to the Soviet side and help NATO establish a credible deterrent. I mean, that was his key role. So it comes down to responsibility, I think, in the end.
Right. Sure.
One other point just springs to mind, which I think is connected, which we are grappling today, which came out at this end of the Cold War, this question of humanitarian interventionism. Remember the breakup of Yugoslavia. Genscher felt really strongly about that we, in this breaking up state of Yugoslavia, we should support the self-determination, in other words, the independence of Croatia and Slovenia, and that Germany actually moved ahead, although in the EC context. But the Americans, for example, were much more cautious, and when we then look at what happened in Bosnia, we have the same problem. This was a state, this is inter-ethnic warfare, and the different powers and organizations weren't sure at all, was this the right time to use force, or should we go with principles? And I think with modern humanitarian interventions, again, we have this problem. I mean, think about it. Clinton really pressed the human rights agenda and talked about these principles. But then, what happens when you move from peacekeeping and peacemaking to peace enforcement? These are very difficult questions, and it's a decision a leader has to make. What exactly are they prioritizing?
Thank you. So we're about at the end. I just say, just yeah.
But in the first 3 years, everybody, apart from the Germans, stayed back, actually. So this change only happened in the mid-1990s. And if you look at what happens from 1990 to 1993, everybody's standing back. Nobody wants to get involved, what they called the quagmire, the powder keg of the Balkans, because of historical fears.
Yeah, I think the lesson as we went into that was back to your point about self-determination. It's always a tricky question. What is the self that is to determine? How do you define that? Because in the Balkans, where peoples and borders don't match, there's not a clear answer. I'm going to try to come to the very end here. I just want to ask my colleague Mike Holtzel to join in. While he's getting ready, Power and Principle, the book by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was actually a professor here at SAIS. And I think last week, Madeleine Albright gave a very stirring recollection of her time with him. Mike.
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate all 7 members of the panel. I mean, every single contribution was first rate. I can't help but respond immediately to Christina, though, before I give my question. It's not always a question of ideals or power. And I would point out what I think was one of the most heroic decisions by a statesman in recent years, and that was Joschka Fischer with regard to Kosovo.
So, yeah.
I mean, he risked the whole coalition, and he said a UN Security Council resolution is important, but stopping genocide is more important. So kudos to Joschka Fischer for that. I'd like to believe that Professor Gavin is correct. I mean, I'm an optimist.
So would I.
I know. It's in my bones, but I have to say the data, at least in the United States, really are contradictory. And I am really afraid there's a paradigm shift that none of us has fully grasped. On the good side, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs just came out with a study that said 70-some% of Americans still believe in a very active international role for the United States. On the negative side, and here comes the paradigm shift, the change in views of Vladimir Putin among self-declared Republicans in this country just defies imagination. Within 2 years, it's gone from about 30% to 55 or 60%. Why? Because of Donald J. Trump. I read an interview in the Süddeutsche Zeitung about 2 weeks ago, interviewed a wonderful man from Chemnitz who was involved back in '89 in democracy and has headed an organization to help refugees. And he went he went to great lengths to explain why people in Chemnitz and in that area are supporting the AfD. And honestly, you could have just taken a red state like West Virginia and substituted the nouns, and it was the exact same explanation of alienation and acting against what would ordinarily be considered your best interests. My final point is I have to believe that the Auswärtige Amt has understood this paradigm shift. I can't think of a better time to have a Deutschlandjahr in the United States. I only hope you find a way, I don't know to whom I'm speaking now, I guess Staatsminister Müntefering, I hope you find a way to connect with the 40% or so of my fellow Americans who seem to believe that Donald Trump has the answers. It's a wonderful initiative.
Okay, so I'm not sure that was a question. And since I don't know if anyone here is compelled to answer or to say something, knowing that you stand between everyone and the end of the session and probably food, if not, let me thank everyone for being here. Really, it was great to have you all join us and celebrate this new type of beginning here with us. To all of our postdoctoral fellows and others who are with us, we look forward to continuing. And Christina and Frank, thank you so much. And Thomas and the entire German delegation, it was a real privilege to have you with us. We hope to continue the discussion. Thank you again. Thank you.